What do you think of when I say the word temptation? Don't tell me. But I know the sort of thing you're thinking, because it's common to everyone. But I'd like to suggest to you that there is another type of temptation. And the second type of temptation is as dangerous, if not more so, than the first. You'll remember last week we looked at the first part of this story. We looked at the story of the prodigal son. And you know what happened. He left home, took his inheritance, made a terrible mess of his life, ended up in poverty and squalor, but then repents and returns home and finds his father joyfully waiting to welcome him home. And the celebration that was there at the beginning of our reading is taking place because, as the father said, this son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. But I would like to suggest to you that in this story, and it's a really important story, there isn't just one lost son. There are two lost sons. So what I mean by that is that we have really clear categories for the type of lostness that the prodigal found himself in. You might call that type 1 lostness. It's very obvious, it's very messy, it's quite dramatic, often very public. It's a very obvious crisis. People get hurt, people get messed up by it. But if there is one good thing about it, is that when people get lost that way, they often tend to realize it. Just as the prodigal did, they see the mess that they've got themselves into. It's the sort of story which is actually quite familiar to us. It's the subject of much great literature, from Dickens to Dostoevsky. But there is another type of lostness, and you might call that type 2 lostness, and that is the kind of lostness that the older brother exhibits. Listen to the story once again. The older brother was in the field. He had been working hard, but you notice that he was not involved at all in the father's concern. You know, the father was sort of wandering the wilderness, looking for and hoping for the return of the prodigal. But that's not what the older brother is worried about at all. He's working hard. He's only really concerned about the family business. He's perhaps thinking someone needs to make up for the fecklessness of that young man. Someone needs to do the work around here. And as a result, he's far from home, and he has no idea that the prodigal has returned. So at the end of the day, he returns home. He hears the music. And instead of going in to find out what's happening, verse 26, do you see what he does? He summons a servant and says to the servant what's going on. And the servant clearly is delighted by the return of the prodigal and the party that's taking place. He uses this lovely phrase. He says that your brother's back, and he's back safe and sound. Can you see the servant is sort of excited along with the father and the whole household? But that's not the older brother's response. Verse 28, he became angry and refused to go in. Now, I suspect that anger which the older brother exhibits isn't a new thing. I think he's been angry for a long time, probably since the prodigal left. And you might say it's justifiable anger. I mean, I think it probably is. What the prodigal did was awful and wasteful, and they've all suffered as a result of it. But what's noticeable is that the father moves on. And the father has clearly forgiven and cares more about the lostness of the son than the damage that he has done. But not the older brother. And his inability to forgive makes him cold and distant and bitter. But what's really significant is he is distant and angry, not just with his brother, which might be justifiable, although probably not a great idea, but clearly also with the father. He refuses to go into the party. So much so that the father has to go out and plead with him. And many commentators have observed in this story the humility of the father in it. Just as you remember when the prodigal came home and he ran to him. And men of status and dignity in the ancient world don't run places. And yet that's what this father does. And in the same way, his anger, stubborn older son, he goes out and he pleads with him to come in, to join the party, to be reconciled to his brother and to him, the father. But the response of the older brother is stark and telling. In verse 29, he says this, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so that I can celebrate with my friends." It's a striking thing that he says. If you don't mind, I'd just like to kind of break it down a little bit forensically so that you can see what's going on here. So what I mean by that is that this older brother seems to think that his relationship with his father is just about duty. All these years I've been slaving for you. That he thinks what his father wants is this work that he's done, and that through the work he earns some kind of status, and therefore he can't understand why the father still loves the prodigal who has done nothing worthy of that love. So he thinks that relationships are about duty. He thinks they're about obedience. He says, "I've never disobeyed your orders." He thinks that what you have to do is follow the rules and obey the things that people tell you to do, and that's what relationships look like. You know it's not. And it is somehow transactional. So he says, "You never gave me even a young goat." He thinks that he's working in order to get reward. And I don't know if that sounds unfamiliar to you, but I think the truth is that many people imagine that what God requires is that we follow the rules, that we do what we are told, and then he will reward us by giving us what we want. I don't think that's unfamiliar at all. But maybe the most telling phrase of all is the last part of it. He says, "You never gave me a young goat so that I can celebrate with my friends." That this son in actual fact cares nothing for a relationship with the father. He is cold and distant and dutiful and judgmental and frustrated and angry. Can you see how alienated he is from the father in the story? There are two types of lostness. The first is very obvious. The second, much less so, but just as dangerous and alienating. I think it's fascinating. What do we do with this story? What do we make of Jesus' teaching here? Well, I think what he is saying is that there are these kind of two equal and opposite errors that people make about life and about relationship with God. There are two kind of deeply flawed ways in which people try and live. But the truth is actually there aren't two types of people. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. It's just it looks different for different people. So the type 1 lostness is amoral. You do whatever you feel like you want to do. You're motivated by your appetites and your desires, or what you see your peers doing. Or type 2 is, we don't think of it as a temptation, but I think it absolutely is. That kind of moralism and dutifulness, that temptation to think that what I need to do is keep the rules and then I will get what I want. That, that kind of temptation is often quite impressive looking. And I think we all do it some of the time because it can be very successful and high achieving. But the consequence of it is that we are justifying ourselves. We have no need of God. We tend to look down on others who don't come up to our standards. And as a result, we can be cold and distant and frustrated and angry. And it's a temptation for all of us. And neither of these are the gospel of grace. Neither of these are the way of Christ. Someone once said it's very hard to stop being the prodigal without becoming the older brother. Isn't that interesting? We are like the proverbial shopping trolley with the wonky wheel. We might lurch off in one direction, and then when we try and correct that, we lurch in the other direction. Don't get me wrong. Doing the right thing is really important. Doing the will of God is a great idea. Life works better that way. But that obedience needs to come out of a relationship with God and out of a love for God, not as a way to try and please God in order to get what we want. And one of the dangers, I think, is as we go on in the Christian life, as we get busy working in the fields like the older brother, we start to think that we're somehow better than other people and that God owes us something. At the point at which you find yourself starting to get frustrated at young Christians, or if you find yourself being angry more of the time, or if your relationship with God is actually becoming a little bit functional and distant, be aware. Be wary that that spirit of the older brother, which is common to so many of us, is at work in our hearts. I think the truth is we never stop being the prodigal. That's always who we are. We are simply repentant sinners in the embrace of a gracious Father. You should never get too far from that place. You might notice that that's the story that we tell in so many of the songs and the hymns that we sing and in our liturgy, because it's always calling us back to that place. That's the place of grace, the place of peace and of joy. When it starts to go wrong, when you start to see the spirit of the older brother rising in you, and it will, remember this: the only thing that actually matters, the only thing which has any eternal value, is that invitation into the eternal relationship of love, which is at the heart of God, at the heart of the universe. That is the thing for which we are made. And that knowing God intimately and personally and joyfully is the thing from which everything else flows. If your priority becomes something other than that, beware. And also note this. Note what actually, in the story, the will of God is. Because we've got a tendency to think it's about kind of doing right and being right and all of those kind of things. And they're fine as far as they go. But in actual fact, in the story, the father is far more concerned with the return of the prodigal than anything else. And that if our priority, if the thing that we are passionate about, isn't the invitation to the prodigals who walk up and down the high street, who are all around us and our friends and our neighbours, then actually we're not really getting hold of what the heart of God is. The thing that ultimately matters more than anything else is that relationship with God the Father through Jesus Christ in the power of the Spirit. And that is the thing to which the older brother is invited and that he refuses. Or does he? Because ultimately we don't really know. I want to argue in actual fact that this is the point of the parable. Because the whole story of the prodigal has a happy ending. We know what happens to the prodigal. What we don't know is what happens to the older brother. It's left on a cliffhanger. What will he do? Will he accept the father's invitation to be reconciled and to come into the party, or will he not? The truth is, well, the hearers of the story, you and I, need to answer that question for ourselves. But we end with the words of that invitation, because I'd like you to hear this for yourself. We said last week that the thing about this story is that when you realize what's going on, you realize that it was always about grace from beginning to end. It isn't about the mistakes that we make or the work that we do in order to try and be good. It was always a gift. And the father's words to the older son are these, and you should hear these for yourself as well. The father said, "My child, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours." My child, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. It was by grace. It will always be by grace. And the greatest thing is to be with the Father in that embrace of love from eternity and to eternity. Amen.